how do you get your vehicle started? It cranks, but it won't start in freezing weather. I mean, look right there. It doesn't take very long to figure out when you have temperatures like minus 35 degrees Celsius and you blow fog like that, it's not a big shocker that a lot of vehicles just won't start when you go to fire them up in the morning. But there's a great number of tips I want to share with you today about ways to get that vehicle started, some of the things to watch out for, how to prepare your vehicle properly, the pitfalls to look out for, and make sure you haven't caused irreversible damage. Let's get into it now. Life's too short to drive boring cars. There's a few things that can cause your vehicle to not start. One of them is poor fuel delivery. When it gets really cold like this, sometimes if diesel fuel sometimes gels up, it doesn't flow so well. Even gasoline, sometimes you get moisture and it breaks away and it winds up plugging off the fuel lines. And the other issue is it just won't crank. Why won't it crank? Because the battery's either weak or it's completely toast. And there's ways to mitigate a weak battery. Number one, of course, is having a good quality battery. As you're going into wintertime like this, if you live in a country where it gets cold all the time, it always helps to have a great battery. If you have a marginal battery, I would suggest putting it on a battery tender like this. Currently, I've run a plug out here, and a plug, I've got this all plugged in. I've got a battery tender right there. This is a charger. This is not hitting it with huge amps. This just gives it a nice, slow, even charge. And then you wire it up to your battery like this. Make sure you're red or you're positive to positive, black is negative. Now this, generally a lower charger like this is only gonna be an amp or 2 amps charge, so it's a very slow charge. It's gonna take time to charge up a weak battery, but it also helps to keep this plugged in overnight. A lot of times people say, hey, can you give me a boost? Well, if your vehicle's cranking and you're cranking, even if it's cold out, it generally doesn't need a boost. A lot of people get that misconception. Now it could be cranking, but really slowly. Yeah, a boost can sometimes help because you need that quicker spin of the engine and the starter to actually give it enough inertia and momentum. Remember, when it's really cold like this, the oil in the bottom of the engine sits there and it becomes almost like a little bit of molasses. It's really slow, drips slow and heavy, and it's hard for all those rotating pieces within the engine to actually turn quick enough to start and fire. So that is a big thing. Make sure your battery's in great shape or get a new battery before winter time. Keep it on the charger if you need to. And of course, if you absolutely need to and you're not even cranking, the vehicle's not turning quick enough, that's probably when you need a boost. Another thing to think about is right here. We've got fuel. Now, if you're going into some really cold weather, I would suggest, even if your vehicle doesn't typically need anything more than regular fuel, it never hurts to add more premium fuel. For example, the top end fueling that you can get usually has a lower alcohol content. It's a higher alcohol content in fueling that often has a lot more potential for water separation, which can lead, of course, to fuel line freeze up. Of course, you can put antifreeze in there. There's a fuel line antifreeze you can add to that. But generally, a better fuel and even fuel stabilizer. If you know you're going into a deep freeze, maybe throw a little container of that fuel stabilizer, let it slosh around for a couple of days, and then that'll help run through the system. It'll help stabilize the fuel and you'll have less problems with icing up within your fuel lines. So definitely try to stay away from the alcohol fuels, especially in the winter time. Now there's another thing to be concerned with. If you're all of a sudden in really cold weather and your coolant or your antifreeze isn't necessarily up to the task, remember, you need something rated for minus 40 degrees Celsius. 50-50 mix typically of water antifreeze if you're using pure concentrate, but basically you have to be rated for at least minus 40 degrees Celsius, or else you might actually experience a potential engine crack. And here's a little check I like to do if you're worried about your engine cracking or your antifreeze is actually underrated. So first of all, I always look at overflow reservoir right here. You can see I've got a pretty good solution right there. Now I know recently we did a radiator change on this and we did a flush as well as antifreeze upgrade here. You can do a quick visual check, make sure you have no mixing of oil in there or anything like that. And more importantly, I go to the dipstick. This is an important check to do at this point. I always like to pull out the dipstick just like this and make sure that your level is basically what you expect, just oil. All you want to see is oil in there. If all of a sudden you've got a high level of antifreeze or you've got water content that pushes a level or looks more milky in here, there could be a risk that you actually cracked your engine block. So in this case, all we see is black oil, and you can see it's just at the max point, so we're in good shape. We can just put that back. But this is a must-do check if you're worried about your coolant or your antifreeze not being rated adequately for minus 40 degrees Celsius. And if you're worried about your engine block actually splitting, this is something you better check to make sure that you don't have a problem with your engine block, because that will usually make its way into the combustion chamber. Now, when a Canadian says, did you plug in your car? Well, a lot of people around the world think, oh, is that an electric car? No, absolutely not. Canadians generally have to plug in their cars. When you look under the hood, a lot of times Canadian cars, you'll find a little cord hanging out there or a cord hanging off the end here. Let's talk about that. As you see, we've got this cord coming out in this loom, and I've currently got that plugged in right now just to warm it up. So when you plug this in, it actually brings 120 to a little element that's plugged and screwed into the side of the engine block, which helps to actually heat up the coolant that runs through the engine, which then in turn helps to indirectly heat up the engine block, which provides enough heat to help the vehicle start a lot easier. So when you've got a northern vehicle, northern climate, always look for that cord and do your best to plug that in. Give it enough time, usually a good couple hours, to give it time to circulate and add enough heat to the engine so it's easier to start. And it's that exact reason why electric cars often struggle, because the batteries aren't rated for these extreme temperatures, minus 40, minus 50. Even though they have their own internal heaters wrapped around the batteries, those then consume power too, and the car can literally finish itself off overnight when you hit these extreme temperatures. So clearly, plug in your vehicle, that's going to help as well. So if you have a warmer engine block and coolant, you have a strong battery, and your fuel is clean because you have no alcohol in there, or you've got stabilizer, then the next step is, how do you actually start the car to make sure you have success? Now, I can't help but share a couple of specific tips when you're actually trying to start your engine. As you got your key in and you're trying to crank it and it's been really cold, a lot of times what a vehicle naturally does is it applies more fuel to the engine than is actually necessary, because it needs more fuel. When it's really, really cold, the engine compensates, adds that extra fuel. So if you've been cranking your engine for a significant amount of time, what you might actually find is starting to flood the engine. If all of a sudden you get that smell of wafting gas, maybe you keep pumping and pumping and pumping, and the car's sputtering, not quite going, but you keep going and going and going, you might smell a strong odor of gas. If you look bad enough, you might even see gas under the tailpipe, gas coming out of the muffler. You might see even gas in all kinds of places, and you'll definitely get significant odors if you keep pumping. Now, if you're flooding your engine and you have even a remote chance of starting it, what I'd suggest in a modern fuel-injected engine, if it's starting to flood and you're starting to get a little more excess fuel, you have to put your foot down to the gas and not pump it. Hold it right to the floor. As in right there, you basically just push and hold it all the way as you're cranking the ignition, and that should sometimes help enough to get enough momentum. Because what that naturally does then is it adds air to the system. If you have too much fuel, you need to balance out the air and fuel mixture, and that holding down the throttle all the way does allow a little more air in there while you're trying to crank the engine, and it gives you even a better fighting chance of starting that motor. So another thing you want to make sure is have least of these lights and other accessories turned on. Let's close this up, make sure the lights go out. And as well, make sure you turn all your fans and all your other auxiliaries off for the time being. Make sure everything's turned off as much as you can. So then what we're going to do is we're going to take the key, we're going to plug it in, and we're going to turn it partially away. Let's give it 10 seconds to actually charge up. So it gives the fuel pump, which may have slow fueling, an opportunity to put fuel to the injectors. We'll let it sit, and then we'll give it a crank.